Hello, and welcome to Philosophy of Science in Nursing. As most of you know, because you're our students, I'm a Buddhist priest, and I'm also a nurse, and will be one of your two professors for this semester. In Buddhism, we distinguish absolute from relative truth, and most of what we experience in life is relative truth. So, as you enter this course, remember that how we create new knowledge is about how we know, and it is heavily influenced by our culture um, and our centuries of history. I recently read this book on hospicing modernity, um, and in it, Vanessa Machado del Vera um, argues that many of the ways that we've been taught to learn are shaped by the assumptions of modernity. That knowledge is something that we can secure, accumulate, and use to gain certainty and control. In this view, learning often becomes a project of mastering information and producing the right answers and demonstrating individual competence. Oliveira suggests that this approach is not neutral, that it actually reflects and reinforces broader colonial and extractive patterns, where the world is treated as something to be known uh, from the outside and then managed and used. And I hope that your PhD experience is more than that. I'm hoping that in this experience that you're learning the importance of new knowledge and creating new knowledge and all the reasons that you're studying a PhD in nursing so that you can make nursing care better. She goes on and she emphasizes that modern learning habits tend to simplify complexity. They encourage us to break messy realities into neat little categories and rush toward solutions and avoid ambiguity and contradictions. But the issue that we most need to face, things like ecological collapse and social violence and enduring inequality in our healthcare systems, are deeply entangled, and they really can't be addressed well through certainty seeking alone. So, for Oliveira, an education that trains people to be uncomfortable with not knowing can leave them poorly prepared for a context where responsible action requires patience and humility and the ability to stay with complexity. A key part of her argument is that learning is not only cognitive, but also relational and embodied. Rather than centering the individual as this autonomous knower, she points to knowledge as something that emerges through relationships with other people, with histories, with places and land, and with more than just the human world. And I think most of you kind of know this as nurses. So this shift matters because it changes what counts as learning, not just acquiring concepts, but transforming how we relate and what feels responsible to us, what we're willing to notice about our own participation in harmful systems. Oliveira uses the metaphor of hospicing to describe the kind of learning she sees as necessary right now. learning to be present with the decline of modernity's harmful promises without rushing into another set of comforting certainties. This involves practices of unlearning, recognizing conditioned responses like defensiveness, urgency, or the need to be innocent, and developing the capacities to sit with that discomfort, to sit with that complicity and uncertainty. And her framing, the point is not that we have this state of paralysis, but it's this deeper maturity. It's acting with accountability and care while relinquishing this fantasy that we all have that we can fully understand things, we can control them, and we can fix the world from within the same patterns that produce the damage in the first place. Again, as nurses, we all know that we have this deep desire to fix, but we can't always fix. So we can regenerate using um, something different. So I ask you that as you enter this course, allow yourself to enter into relationship with your colleagues in the class, your professors, and with nursing, not as a profession, but as a thing. Before we can ask what nursing knows, we have to ask what it means to know anything at all. Open your minds and think broader. So, a nurse at the bedside observes that a patient's in pain. He or she knows this, but how do we know it? Well, we could know it through a pain scale or through the patient's facial expression or through years of clinical intuition. And we can also think about, well, how are we going to prove this? Well, we could do a randomized controlled trial that validated the assessment tools that we're using. But each of these represents a different answer to the question, what counts as legitimate knowledge? How did we know that that patient was in pain? So this isn't a trivial question about how we know because the answer actually shapes what research gets funded, what evidence is considered valid, what clinical judgments are trusted, what counts as nursing's unique contribution to health science. And so we enter this study of philosophy of science, understanding that philosophy is the discipline that examines these foundational questions. It doesn't give us easy answers, but it gives us better tools for asking the right questions and for recognizing when our assumptions are doing more work than our evidence is. So, philosophy is not decoration on top of nursing science. It is the foundation beneath it. Now, um, I want to talk to you a little bit about Blackburn, which is one of your books. And Blackburn basically is, to me, an introduction to philosophy and maybe how we think. So many years ago, when I would, and this is an older book, so you'll notice by the date, it's an older book. But many years ago, when I was working on my PhD, um, my husband gave me a copy of this book, and he said that it would help me to frame the big thoughts I was going to be having. So he was very hopeful for what would come. And And he also, at the same time, had a desk made for me. And I wish I wasn't on my desktop and I was using my laptop and I would show it to you. But it's this big oak desk that was handmade and has my name engraved in it. And it is a piece of art itself, but he had it made because he said that it was a place that I should only work on big thoughts. I shouldn't bring my work home from me and sit at this desk and do it. The only thing I should do is my dissertation at this desk and my academic work. So for me at that time, that was a big deal. I was running a command center. So to not bring my work home with me was kind of a big deal. So when I walked into this space that I'd set up, and it's probably a space similar to the one I'm in now, although it was in the DC metro area at the time. Um, the only thing I focused on when I was in that space was my PhD. So it was kind of like a sacred academic space. And I invite each of you to establish your own space, to have your own big thoughts, and to just think this semester. Blackburn opens by describing philosophy as an attempt to think clearly about some of the most fundamental questions that human beings face. Questions about knowledge and reality and mind and ethics and existence. He argues that these questions can't be avoided, that they can only be answered well or poorly. He then lists questions that we might ask ourselves or about ourselves and others that we might ask about the world. And I invite you to take a look at the list of questions that you might ask about nursing. Then he moved to the questions involving ourselves and the world. So think about this first question in the series. How can we be sure the world is really like we think it to be? I'll read you this small section that meant a lot to me. So, a lot of life is indeed a matter of raising more hogs to buy more land so we can raise more hogs so that we can buy more land. The time we take out, whether it is to do mathematics or music or to read Plato or Jane Austen, it is the time to be cherished. It is the time in which we close our, that we basically close our mental health. And our mental health is just good in itself, like our physical health. Furthermore, there is, after all, a payoff in terms of pleasure. When our physical health is good, we take pleasure in physical exercise. And when our mental health is good, we take pleasure in mental exercise. How you think about what you are doing affects how you do it and whether you do it at all. It may direct your research or your attitude to people who do things differently, or indeed your whole life. So that was from page 7 of Blackburn. So it really is a good book. I hope you enjoy reading it. I hope it has as big of an influence on the way you think in this program as it did on me when I was in mine. So Blackburn argues that philosophy's primary job is to examine the concepts that we use without examining. Words like knowledge, truth, evidence, reality, and person are used constantly in nursing science, but rarely integrated. What do we actually mean when we say a nursing intervention is evidence-based? And what kind of evidence? Evidence of what? Evidence for whom? Blackburn's method is to slow down, to look carefully at the concepts that we take for granted, and to ask whether they hold up under scrutiny. This isn't skepticism for its own sake, it's intellectual rigor. So he goes on to distinguish between first order and second order questions. And he draws a useful distinction. First order questions ask what is true. So, does this intervention actually reduce pain? And second order questions ask, how do we know what is true? So, what makes something count as knowledge? For example, what kind of study design and what kind of evidence, what kind of reasoning justifies the claim that we're making? Nursing science is primarily engaged in first order questions. Philosophy of science asks the second order questions. This course operates at the second order level, not to undermine nursing science, but to make it more rigorous and self aware. So, what do you think? Who is nurse? So, what's the discipline and the identity? Who are we as a science? Um, what are our research questions, and what are the questions that actually count? And what do we accept as valid evidence? And I lost my PowerPoint there for a minute, so my apologies. Let's move on to the next slide. So, imagination can be abandoned. This is this is a picture which I'll explain in a minute, but it's an old Goya print. And I show it to you because Marx said that philosophers had sought to understand the world, and he thought the point was to change it. So Marx thought the point of that we while we try to understand the world is so that we can change the world. Um, Asking so many questions that examine what truth is makes some people very uncomfortable. So we live in a time when many people question truth and reason, and they aren't interested in reflection or deep thought about any issue. And we see this all the time in our society. And the readings that we've provided, including Think, follow the traditions against this postmodern skepticism. So this picture is Goya's full, and I'll tell you, I'll translate and tell you the motto that's written on it. But Goya's full model for his etching is imagination abandoned by reason produces impossible monsters. United with her, she is the mother of the arts and the source of wonders. This is how we should live and take it to be. If you're interested, this isn't an art class, and I'm not an art historian, but there's a whole series of Goya uh, prints on monsters, and they're interesting and worth looking at. But again, not the topic of this course. Here's the topic of this course. So these are our learning objections. You need to discuss the foundations of nursing science in philosophy, uh, science, culture, and society. You will evaluate nursing construction as a discipline. You'll analyze diverse philosophical traditions shaping nursing knowledge. You will discuss the developing nursing knowledge, and you'll demonstrate dialectic reasoning and nursing inquiry. So this module's objectives are a little more limited than that. We're going to discuss the foundations of nursing science in the context of philosophy, science, culture, and society, and hopefully demonstrate skill in didactic reasoning to support arguments regarding the conduct of nursing inquiry and the development of nursing knowledge. So let's get started. What you're going to be reading uh, for this module. There's more reading. I like reading. Sorry, there's more reading for this semester, but this is what you're going to be reading for this semester. You're going to be reading Think, A Compelling Introduction to Philosophy by Blackmore. These are core philosophical concepts. Knowledge development, nursing theory, and process. There is in your version. You can feel free to use either one of them. And then I want you to look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's open access, and it's just because it's a really great source for you. So please don't think I want you to read the whole thing. I want you to use it as a tool. Blackburn makes the point that every one of us operates with philosophical assumptions, whether we acknowledge them or not. So a researcher who insists that only what can be measured counts as evidence is making a philosophical claim. Um, a deeply contestable one, but still. So it's not a neutral scientific observation. So making those assumptions explicit in the beginning of philosophical thinking is important. And I hope you fully engage with this book. It's easy to read, it's written in a very clear style, and it gives relevant examples. And there are very few books that are non-nursing that give relevant examples that most nurses can relate to, but this one really does. So in knowledge development nursing, you're going to explore many of the same issues as in Think, but from a nursing perspective and with more detail about specifics of how nurses know. The first chapter identifies the need to be broad and in some ways points to the need for caring and knowing. The text says, and I quote, these quotes underscore three important ideas. Nursing science should focus broadly on the development of knowledge that is consistent with the central purpose of the discipline. To decolonialize, meaning looking beyond social constructed classifications such as race and creating space that encourages all nurses to nurture, cultivate, and develop ways to improve health outcomes and the conditions where nurses learn, educate, practice, and conduct research. There are different ways of knowing and doing than the norms of Western science. These need to be recognized, valued, and put into practice. What we value as nurses determines and drives knowledge development. In this text, we call for ways to think broadly, to consider carefully what you want to know, and to be an effective nurse, and to think about the values that grounded your knowing and knowledge development in nursing education. Now, that you have some kind of idea, a little bit of a sense of what philosophy is and why it matters, we can turn to the most directly relevant branch of nursing science, epistemology and the theory of knowledge. So let's move on. So, what does count as legitimate knowledge? in nursing science. Um, Blackburn's chapter on knowledge is probably the most accessible introduction to epistemology that's available. The central question is really simple, and it's what is knowledge? Um, so the classic definition to say it's justified true belief. So not a false belief, but a true belief. So the traditional philosophical answer, however, going back to Plato, is that knowledge is a justified true belief. So to know something, um, three considerations must be met. You believe it, it is true, and you are justified in believing it. This sounds really straightforward, but each condition raises hard questions. What counts as justification? Can we even be certain something is true? And what is our justification is good, but our belief is still wrong? Now, that happens. So, how do we know that our methods of knowing are reliable? Um, we can't step outside our own knowledge to check it against reality directly. Um, so, this is not a reason to despair. It is a reason for humility and for rigor. So, it means that knowledge claims are always provisional, always open to revision, always dependent on the quality of the reasoning and the evidence behind them. Um, I think it's one of the reasons I really think it's important for nurses to read notes on nursing, because when that was written, it was considered true. And some of it's probably still true, but some of it we clearly know isn't. Um, so when a nurse says research shows that X intervention is effective, what kind of justification is being offered? And what about clinical expertise, patient narrative? What about cultural knowledge? What about community wisdom? Blackburn doesn't answer these questions for us, but he gives us the tools to ask them carefully. Every time nursing science makes a knowledge claim, it's implicitly taking a position on what counts as justification, what counts as truth, and what counts as a belief worth acting on. So let me briefly introduce epistemological positions to you. So there is a position core claim that you can make. Let me try to give you nursing example of empiricism and knowledge. So we say that this comes from sensory experiences and observations through randomized controlled trials. So measurement and quantitative research. And and I'll stop here and say this. As nurses, we know that what happens in these very controlled environments in randomized controlled trials is not what you are going to see on the average unit in a hospital. It just isn't, because you can't carefully control everything on your unit in the hospital. So then there's rationalism knowledge that comes from reason and logical inference. Um, so through theory development, um, which can be fun, but it requires you to remember you're still seeking truth. There's pragmatism, which is what works in practice. So, evidence-based practice or clinical judgment. How did you know that patient was in pain? Um, these really aren't mutually exclusive, and nursing science draws on all three of them, but it tends to privilege empiricism. One of the goals of this course is to examine whether that privileging is justified and what it costs. In philosophy of science and nursing science context, epistemology is the study of knowledge. So, what counts as knowledge, how we justify claims, and what makes a belief reliable rather than a mere option. It asks questions like, what is evidence? How do observation, measurement, theory, and interpretation relate? And when is clinical generalization warranted? In nursing, epistemology shows up in debates about the status of different ways of knowing. For example, experimental studies, qualitative inquiry, clinical judgment, and simple patient testimony. So, what can I know and how can I know it? Um, and it thinks about criteria for good justification. So, you'll hear us talk about validity and credibility and reproducibility, coherence with the background theory. In Blackburn's style, it's centrally about reason for belief. In Chin's tradition, it is also about how nursing knowledge is generated, evaluated, and then refined within practice and discipline specific aims. So there's more than just knowing. It has to be, in Chin's interpretation, then we have to make it specific to nursing and the aims of nursing. Ontology is the study of what exists and what kinds of things the world contains, especially the categories we assume when we do science. So, objects, properties, processes, mechanics, persons, diseases, even social structures. For nursing, ontology questions often sit just beneath the surface. Are pain, fatigue, well being, or risk primary biological states? Are they subjective experiences? Are they relational phenomena? Or are they some combination of these things? Is the patient best understood as an individual organism, so a holistic whole person with agency and identity? Or is this little node in a family and a social system? Ontological commitments shape what researchers treat as real and what they measure and why they think causal explanations should look like. So they influence everything from the study design to what counts as an adequate account of health and illness. Um, so ethics ask us things like, what ought we to do? So it kind of anchors our moral practice and our decision making. And in philosophy of science, ethics concerns what we ought to do in inquiry and in practice. So, how values should guide our research and our clinical decisions and the use of evidence. And it includes some very familiar biomedical norms. So, respect for the person, beneficence, maleficence, justice. You all heard this as undergraduates, but also ethics of inquiry, issues such as honesty in reporting, responsible handling of uncertainty, fair representation of participants in conflict of interest, and the moral implications of how problems are faced. For example, outcomes matter and whose voice counts as evidence. So remember that honesty and integrity in research is what led us to a lot of false beliefs people have about vaccines and autism. It happened because of bad science that somebody produced. And long after, when people knew that it was false, they kept putting it out there as evidence, knowing that it had been shown to be false. Um, in nursing, ethics really is tightly linked to the lived states of knowledge. So epistemic choices, what counts as evidence, which endpoints are prioritized. And these can have distributive and dignity related consequences for patients and for communities, making value neutrality an aspiration that needs careful qualification rather than an assumption. And then we have meaning and language. And meaning and language ask how words and statements get their content and how that content connects to the world, especially in scientific and clinical contexts. It matters because nursing knowledge depends on terms that must be used consistently, yet sensitively. So think of things like health and function and quality of life and depression and noncompliance and normal. Philosophers analyze meaning through tools like reference. So what a term picks out and a sense or a concept. So how is it understood? And use it in practices. So how it functions in reasoning and measurement and in communication. In nursing, we give attention to how meaning helps clarify definitions and improve measurements and how we operationalize those measurements. It helps us reduce ambiguity and stigma, and it makes visible how patient narratives and professional language can sometimes diverge. So it supports both the conceptual rigor and better clinical understanding. So, as I mentioned previously about reading Hospicing Modernity, which really does align with chapter one of, of knowledge development in nursing, Chin states the traditions and methods of empirics limit knowing and knowledge to European centric ways of knowing and serve to exclude other knowledge traditions. Recognizing and valuing personal and ethical and aesthetic knowing patterns, it is possible to break beyond the limits of empiric knowing alone. And she goes on to identify a fifth pattern of knowing. And the fifth pattern of knowing that is central to the text is emancipatory knowing, and it provides another important path toward expanding and enriching nursing knowledge foundations. So directly quoted from Chin. Um, in some ways, this is really similar to what Vanessa Machado de Oliveira says in Hospicing Modernity. And she says that modernity predetermines what can be heard and what we accept as real and possible. It even limits what we can imagine as desirable and how things are supposed to make us feel. Most of us would argue that education is much broader than what we learn in school. And anybody that's ever been a practicing nurse knows that. You know what you brought with you to the classroom, and you know what you learned at the bedside. So she distinguishes between mastery and depth education. She says mastery education is contrasted with depth education. This is defined as a mode of engagement designed to prompt us to dig deeper and to relate wider. Disinvest in harmful desire. Activate accountability and responsibility before will, not as an intellectual choice or as a translational calculation, and become open to being taught by the world in unexpected ways. Depth education focuses on complexities and paradoxes, and it invites all of us to sit with difficulties, to unpack investments, to confront resistance, disarm effective landmines, relate beyond meaning, identity, and understanding, rationally explore the limits of rationality, and face humanity within and around us in all its complexity, the good, the bad, the broken, and the messed up. Um, so, hospiting modernity really isn't just this historical era, but it's a civilizational project that aims to engineer society through um, authority of humanism and reason and science and progress, and even our technology. So, a project that promises universal improvement while defining what counts as civilized or developed or rational. So, when Oliveria names it modernity slash coloniality, she really is emphasizing that modernity's success and self-image are separable, are inseparable, sorry, from colonial conquest, from racialized hierarchy, from extraction, and from the production of others who can be dispossessed, disciplined, and rendered disposable. Modernity basically functions as an epistemic order. It doesn't just propose policies, it actually shapes what is real, what can be known, and what kinds of futures are considered legitimate. So, epistemologically, modernity tends to privilege knowledge that is generalizable, measurable, and controllable, produced by an allegedly neutral observer uh, over and above the world. So basically, she's kind of talking about randomized controls trials by researchers who are invested in an outcome. Um, Good knowledge becomes tied to prediction management. So, an intervention and often treating uncertainty and spirituality and place-based understanding and our lived experiences is less rigorous, or just saying it's subjective, and so it doesn't count. And in nursing, this shows up when certain forms of evidence, especially those easiest to standardize, become the default standard of truth, while other ways of knowing, such as patient testimony or relational knowledge or community member or indigenous knowledge, moral distress, while these are treated as secondary, even though they may be crucial to understanding suffering, harm, and healing. Ontologically, modernity often assumes separability. So Individuals are these discrete units. The body is a machine, nature is external resource, and social worlds can be uh, redesigned like systems. It also organizes reality through these hierarchies of being. So, fully human or not fully human, developed or undeveloped, or even underdeveloped, rational or irrational. And this makes some lives and losses appear more grievable, more worthy than others. In nursing science and practice, these ontological assumptions can quietly structure the categories that we use. Things like compliance and risk and normal, and even the definition of what is health, pushing care towards managing bodies and populations while obscuring the relational, historical, and ecological dimensions of illness and well being. Ethically, modernity often frames the good as process. So, more capacity, more efficient, doing more with less, innovation, optimization. And it can justify harm through trade offs in the name of improvement, especially when harms fall on already marginalized communities. Oliveira's her framing kind of pushes you to ask the question, does the intervention work? But it also pushes us to ask, what does it require and who pays? What does it erase? For nursing, this connects epistemology to ethics. So, research methods, outcome measures, and institutional best practices are not value neutral. They can reproduce inequality if they assume one universal pathway to health or treat communities primarily as sites of intervention rather than holders of knowledge and agency. With modernity, Oliveira is pointing to a package deal. Modernity supplies a story about reality, ontology, a method for authoring truth, um, and moral narrative about improvements. And these reinforce the others. So, hospicing maternity then becomes this philosophical practice of learning to recognize the limits and the cost. So, the limits and the cost of that package, tolerating the discomfort of the uncertainty and the complicity, and making room for forms of knowing and being that modernity has disqualified. And if any of you have ever tried to get qualitative research funded, it's hard. And one of the reasons is so many people say, well, that's not legitimate knowing. So if we want to think more about what Chin and Kramer say, they open their textbook with the claim that nursing is a discipline and that it's not merely a profession or a set of technical skills. So, a discipline is defined by a distinctive body of knowledge, a set of questions it considers its own, and a commitment to developing the knowledge systematically over time. What makes nursing knowledge distinctive is a question you're going to be answering. Excuse me. It's a question you're going to be answering in this course. So, Chin and Kramer argue that nursing knowledge is oriented toward a particular purpose. And That is the wholeness and well-being of human beings. This isn't the same as medicine's orientation toward disease and cure, or sociology's orientation toward social structure, or psychology's orientation toward individual behavior. Nursing focus is integrative. It attends to the whole person in context. And this does have some direct implications for epistemology. If nursing subject matter is the whole person in context, then methods designed to isolate variables and control for context may be systematically inadequate for nursing purposes. This isn't an argument against rigor, it's an argument for broader conception of what rigor means in nursing science. So let's talk a little bit about the concept of nursing's meta paradigm. Uh, Kramer and Chen introduced the concept of the meta paradigm as the broadest conceptual framework that defines a discipline's domain. And for nursing, there are four meta paradigm concepts, and they've been in place for a long, long time. They are person, so the person who's receiving nursing care; health, the goal of nursing care; environment, the context in which nursing care occurs; and nursing, the actions and processes of the discipline itself. And these four concepts really are not neutral descriptions. They're philosophical commitments. So, how nursing defines person as a biological organism, a social being, a spiritual entity, a relational process, all of this shapes everything downstream. It shapes what questions are asked, what methods are used, and what counts as a good outcome. The meta paradigm is a philosophical framework. It's not a scientific one. It can't be derived from data. So it has to be argued for, examined, and revised through philosophical reasoning. Uh, Chen and Kramer go a little bit further than the meta paradigm. They argue that nursing knowledge is not a single unified thing, it's structured into distinct patterns of knowing. Um, each of those patterns has its own logic methods and standards of validity. So just keep in mind, we have to have clarity, we have to have logic, we have to have a critical analysis, and we have to be able to make an argument. So, one of the other things you're going to see in chapter 2 is Chen and Kramer's work on the elaboration of Barbara Harper's original 1978 framework on patterns of knowing and nursing. And I included an article that kind of goes a little further than this in the Canvas site, so you'll be able to see that and take a look at it. But this framework really argues that nursing knowledge can't be reduced to a single type. It's an irreducible plural, which is to say, um, if we think about the four regional patterns extended in Chen that you see here, um, empirics in the science of knowing. So this is the pattern most familiar to academic nursing. It's systematic, it's replicable, it's evidence-based knowledge, and it includes quantitative research, clinical trials, epidemiology, and the development of nursing theories that can be tested empirically. Empirics answers the question, what is this and how does it work? Ethics is number 2, and it's the moral component of knowledge, nursing knowledge. So ethical knowledge in nursing isn't simply about rule following. It involves the capacity to reason carefully, um, to recognize moral complexity, and then to have the ability to act with integrity in situations where the right course of action isn't always obvious. And I'm sure every one of you, if you've been in clinical practice for any period of time, have seen situations like this. But it answers the question, what ought I to do? What should I do? What is right? Aesthetics is the art of nursing. So we always say nursing is an art and a science. So aesthetics is the art of nursing. And aesthetic knowing really is the capacity to perceive the whole of a situation. Um, the ability for us to grasp what's really significant and to respond with a level of skill and sometimes with a level of creativity and to act in ways that are fitting rather than merely correct. Um, so, how would I say this? So, I guess it's the knowledge that's embedded in the clinical practice that really can't be fully spelled out in our protocols and our rules. So, aesthetics kind of answers the questions like what is happening here and how should I respond to it? And then, of course, there's the personal knowing. And personal knowing is your own self awareness as a nurse, and your capacity to have this authentic relationship. And this really involves knowing yourself. So you need to know yourself well enough to be genuinely present with another person and to avoid projecting your own assumptions onto that patient and to use this therapeutic relationship really as a very genuine instrument of care. So personal knowing answers the question, who am I in this encounter and how does that shape what I can offer to this other person? So Chin and Kramer also added to the model um, emancipatory knowing. And it asks who benefits from the current arrangement of nursing knowledge and who's marginalized by it. It's really the capacity to recognize and to challenge social, political, and institutional structures that constrain health and well-being. And this pattern is especially relevant in nursing engagement with health equity, with structural racism, and with social determinants of health. So these are things that we know we face, we know that we address, and some of the times, sometimes when we're practicing, we don't actually recognize it when we see it because we've been taught how to perceive things. And so I don't know how you're perceiving something. I know how I'm perceiving it. And we really have to work when we're in clinical situations or when we're designing research to recognize that our perceptions aren't the only true and accurate ones. So we are not always the purveyor of truth. Um, Also, Chin and Kramer um, added that, this unknowing is really the deliberate suspension of assumptions in order to be genuinely open to a patient's experience. It's really to recognize that what we think we know can prevent us from seeing what is actually there. And if we go back to the pain examples, there are lots of studies about pain and the perception of pain. And we now know that people experience pain differently. I may have a very high pain threshold, and my husband may have a very low pain threshold. I have cats. Cats generally don't ever, unless you step on their tail, in which case you will immediately know that hurt. But generally, when they're sick and they're in pain, the first sign you get they're sick and they're in pain is they stop eating. And by then, it's too late to really do anything significant. But it wasn't like they weren't in pain. It's just we didn't recognize that they were in pain because they're really stoic. And there are people who are really stoic, so you're not going to know they're in pain. And there are other people that we know that we should know at this point that they're in pain, and yet we've been so taught to not see it in certain people that we don't. So it's a problem. So let's take a little bit deeper dive. Carpenter's patterns of knowing remain one of the foundational frameworks in nursing epistemology because they define nursing knowledge as inherently plural rather than exclusively scientific. So Carpenter proposed the four foundational patterns. So empirical knowing, the science of nursing that's grounded in observation, theory, and research. Aesthetic knowing, the art of nursing expressed in skilled, context sensitive, and meaningful actions. Personal knowing, or the reflective and relational knowledge that supports authentic therapeutic engagement. And then ethical knowing, the moral dimensions concerned with judgments about what we ought to be doing. And if you put these things together, these patterns frame nursing as a discipline that kind of integrates evidence, interpretation, self awareness, and moral reasoning and practice. And then after this, so keep in mind, some of this was done in the 70s. So later nursing scholars that came along expanded this framework um, to address some of the structural and political dimensions of care. And as we noted one of the things they added was this emancipatory knowing. And it really does center recognizing injustice, inequality, oppressive social conditions, and then acting to change that, to transform it. This extension is important because it improves nursing knowledge beyond the bedside and into the social world, emphasizing that competent nursing involves not only understanding patients' immediate needs, but also confronting the systems that really do shape the outcomes. Um, in this expanded view of things, then nursing knowledge really includes critical awareness of power and privilege and policy making that the framework basically kind of brings to light some of our contemporary concerns about health equity and about social justice. So it's really trying to get us to where when you come in to receive health care, the outcomes are the same for everyone, that everyone has good outcomes, not just some. Um, so in Thorne's article about rethinking Harper's professional knowing in the 21st century, which I included in the canvas for you, uh, Basically, Thorne kind of affirms the enduring value of Carper's framework, but argues that personal knowing now requires this renewed critical examination. And Thorne suggests that while nursing has continued to develop empirical, ethical, and even aesthetic knowledge, personal knowing has sometimes been left insufficiently integrated. Um, After 9/11 and the anthrax attacks, Senator Frist once said, public health has suffered from benign neglect. And I think what this article is saying is that personal knowledge has suffered from benign neglect. Um, as a result, it can be misunderstood as validating individual beliefs, attitudes, or even subjective conventions simply because they're sincerely held. And Thorne contends that this interpretation departs from Carper's uh, original intent, which was not to legitimize personal opinion, but to emphasize reflective self awareness and authentic relational presence within nursing practice. So, know yourself. Know yourself. This isn't saying that it's about personal opinion. That's not what they mean by personal knowledge. They, yes, it's much deeper than that. So, a central argument of the article is that personal knowing was never meant to override evidence or to justify idiosyncratic professional positions. Thorne warns us that if we treat it uncritically, personal knowing can be used to support anti scientific attitudes, politically motivated claims, and even religiously grounded beliefs presented as nursing knowledge. Um, Basically, she particularly is concerned that appeals to multiple ways of knowing can blur the distinction between a disciplined professional judgment and personal ideology. So, in that sense, or in this sense, the article isn't a rejection of pluralism in nursing knowledge, but it is a call to restore the conceptual clarity regarding the proper role of personal knowing within the broader epistemological framework of the discipline. And Thorne also argued that the issue has significant implications for nurses' collective moral and social mandate. She maintained that nursing has to be able to uphold a coherent set of shared professional values, especially in relation to issues such as racism, reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, equitable access to care, harm reduction, and the dignity of marginalized populations. And for Thorne, a profession that can't distinguish between individual belief and shared disciplinary commitment risks losing its capacity for advocacy and public moral leadership. So personal knowing is valuable um, only when it remains connected to critical reflection, sound evidence, ethical reasoning, and nursing responsibility to serve patients and communities rather than the individual nurse's self-interest. So overall, Thorne's article really reframes the discussion of Carper's patterns by arguing that the issue is not whether nursing should value multiple ways of knowing, but how these ways of knowing should be ordered, balanced, and disciplined. I really want you to read that article. Obviously, it's not part of your required reading, but I do think that it's valuable and that you will find it helpful. Um, Now let's review all of this kind of now as a whole. So the patterns of knowing are not just about nostalgic theory in nursing or nostalgic nursing theory frameworks, but as a philosophy of science tool for doctoral work. Uh, Chin and Kramer and Sitzman kind of extended Carper's original claim that nursing knowledge is irreducibly plural, and that as a discipline, nursing can't be fully grounded in only one epistemic current. We can't just have this one currency. We have to have multiple ways of knowing. And the point for you as PhD students is not to name the pattern in a paper. Um, it's to use the patterns as a disciplined way to ask what counts as knowledge? What counts as knowledge right here, right now? What's being left out? And what kind of rigor is required for this claim I'm making? And the patterns function like kind of complementary lenses that shape how we design studies, how we interpret the findings, justify the interventions that we're going to be doing, and how we argue for the significance of nursing as a science and a practice. So empirics is the pattern that's most aligned with our conventional scientific epistemology. So theory development, hypothesis testing, predictions, and explanations. It answers again the questions: what is happening? How does it work? Under what conditions? At the PhD level, Chin and colleagues help you to see empirics is necessary but not sufficient. So empirics becomes the strongest when we are explicit about its limits. So what the design can and cannot do, what the measures actually capture, and what uncertainties remain. So, as doctoral students, your move is to treat empirics as one mode of knowing that must be placed in conversation with all the other forms of knowing, not as the sole arbiter of truth. So, you have you have to use this, you want to use this, but it's not all. Aesthetic knowing and is the art of nursing. It's easy to make it the caricature of the institution. But Chin and her colleagues basically treat it as a legitimate, practice-grounded way of grasping the meaning and salience of a situation. It answers the question, what is happening here? This particular moment and with this particular person, and why the response is fitting. In our terms as doctoral students, aesthetic knowing helps us to explain why excellent care cannot be fully reduced to protocols. It involves pattern recognition, timing, responsiveness, and our skill ability to perform our job. So, grasping the particular situation and responding with creativity and intuition and the craft of nursing. So, it's knowledge that's enacted at that moment of care. It's also where many qualitative findings land, not merely themes, but clinically consequential understanding of what matters, why we noticed it, and how the action is shaped. So, personal knowing. Um, personal knowing is kind of the therapeutic use of yourself. It is self awareness and authenticity in the relationships. And the nurse becomes part of that instrument of care. Personal knowing concerns the disciplined use of yourself, of self, in relationships. So, self awareness, authenticity, and the capacity to be genuinely present with projecting one's assumptions on the patient or the community. It answers the question, who am I in this encounter? And how does that shape what I can know and what I can do? And for you as PhD students, personal knowing becomes methodological. Reflexivity is not just a qualitative requirement, but a general scientific virtue in nursing because the knower is often part of the knowledge producing situation. In interviews, implementation work, participatory designs, clinical scholarship, and even in how we frame problems. So, personal knowing is also where we locate positionality as epistemically relevant rather than merely autobiographical. And one of the things we do sometimes refer to things as contemplative care is that we learn how when we enter a room, we enter that room and we're 100% there with that patient at that moment. We have left the other patients at the door and we have not yet engaged with the person we're going to next. So you work at being fully present. This isn't always easy because you usually have to pause before you enter a room. You have to let go of everything else. And then you come in and you're fully present. So, personal knowing really is a therapeutic use of yourself. Um, and then let's move on to ethical knowing. And this is kind of the moral component. So, what ought to be done? Justice, rights, responsibilities. It's the capacity to make principled decisions under uncertainty. So it isn't an add-on. Um, it's not just a section of your IRB that you're going to do to be compliant. It's a mode of knowledge with its own standards of adequacy. And it answers the question, what ought to be done? And what's defensible justification in the context of what we're doing? And for you as PhD nursing students, ethical knowing shows up in your research questions and your endpoints of those research questions, of those studies. It should be in the design, who is included and who's excluded, and in the interpretation. So, what we recommend given some level of uncertainty. And and importantly, ethical um, ethical knowing is where we acknowledge that nursing science is value laden in responsible ways. It aims at human flourishing and the reduction of suffering and injustice, so that we have to be able to articulate the values that are embedded in the best evidence and in the best practices. And now we're going to turn back to emancipatory knowing. So Chin and Steitzman are uh, this was really an influential expansion of their work. And it explicitly targets the relationship between knowledge and power. Emancipatory knowing asks what social, political, and economic and institutional forces are structuring the situation and what would it mean to change them. Um, it trains us to see that many nursing categories and routines, things like risk stratification and compliance language, high utilizer or vulnerable populations, all of these carry assumptions about normality and responsibility and deservedness. Um, as PhD students, for you, emancipatory knowing is what turns a project from describing disparities to analyzing mechanisms of inequality and designing knowledge that supports transformation. And that can be through policy or organizational change or community partnerships. It could be reframing what counts as a health problem in the first place. A core takeaway out of chapter 2 of the Chin book is that each pattern has its own form of rigor. Um, it has its own criteria for what makes a knowledge claim credible and defensible. So empirics demand warranted inference. Ethics demands justification and coherence. Aesthetics demands fittingness and skilled discernment. Personal knowing demands this authenticity and this discipline, reflexivity. But emancipatory knowing demands critical analysis of power and responsibility toward change. So, as doctoral students, the task is often integration. Um, so, we build research programs that are empirically strong, ethically defensible, clinically meaningful, um, hopefully relationally accountable, and they should also be structurally aware. When we do that, we stop treating nursing as applied medicine and instead we articulate nursing's distinctiveness as a discipline and its contribution to science, knowing that it's simultaneously about bodies and about people and about relationships and about systems and even about justice and injustice. Now let's try to make this content all kind of come together. Um, and I want it to come together with this week's dialectic discussion prompt. Uh, is nursing knowledge fundamentally distinct from other forms of knowledge, or is it derivative? So the case for distinctiveness you're going to be making. So drawing on Chin and Kramer, you can argue that nursing knowledge is genuinely distinct because its subject matter, the whole person in context, it's oriented toward well-being, is not reducible to any other discipline's domain. Its patterns of knowing include forms of knowledge that are not recognized as legitimate in medicine or the natural sciences. Its meta paradigm reflects philosophical commitments that are specific to nurses' purposes and values. So then you will make the case for its derivativeness. So drawing on Blackburn's epistemological framework, you could argue that nursing knowledge is derivative because the basic epistemological standards of justification and truth and belief are the same in nursing as any other knowledge producing discipline. Um, Much of nursing empirical knowledge is borrowed from medicine and biology and psychology and sociology, and the claim to distinctiveness may reflect a professional boundary, drawing more uh, than genuine epistemological differences. So, then you need to make the dialectic move. So, neither position is obviously correct, and both can be defended with rigor. So, what matters? What matters for you at the doctoral level? Remember, you're writing at a doctoral level now. So, what were so what position are you going to take, and how well can you defend it? With clear concepts, logical arguments, engagement and evidence, and genuine responsiveness to opposing views. And you need opposing views. So, this is exactly what Blackburn means with philosophical thinking, not the assertion of a position, but the careful, honest examination of reasons for and against it. And then you want a provocation to close this whole argument. So um, let me give you one. In nursing, if nursing knowledge is truly distinct, what follows? How does it need? How does it need its own epistemology, its own standards of evidence, or its own methods? And if it's derivative, what is nursing's unique contribution to the knowledge that it borrows and that it applies? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're about the questions this course is designed to help you answer. So, nursing knowledge is fundamental on its own. It has a unique focus on the caring relationship. It's holistic, biopsychosocial, spiritual integration. It has multiple patterns of knowing beyond the empirical. It's practice-based theory and practice fuse. It's ontological focus on human response to health. And it's derivative. Nursing knowledge is borrowed and applied. It borrows from psychology, sociology, physiology. It overlaps heavily with medicine and public health. Applied science, it translates theory generated elsewhere. It's interprofessional practice, presumes shared knowledge, and pragmatically, source matters less than the outcomes. So, where are we? And what's next? So you have to use dialect reasoning in your writing. So you have to move beyond at this point in your education, this one-sided argument. In this course, dialectic reasoning isn't just a philosophical exercise, it really is the core method that you will use to develop and defend your ideas about nursing knowledge. As Shelley Kagan emphasized in How to Write a Philosophy Paper, which again is on Canvas for you, a strong philosophical paper or discussion post does far more than state an opinion or summarize readings. It requires you to stake out a clear thesis, offer the best argument for it, and then deliberately engage the strongest opposing view. This process mirrors the central debate on this slide. Whether nursing knowledge is fundamentally distinct or rooted in the unique caring relationship, holistic patterns of knowing, and practice-based ontology, or derivative, borrowed from medicine, psychology, and other disciplines, and applied in interprofessional contexts. Dialectic reasoning helps you to move past simple choosing one side and instead produce and demonstrate intellectual honesty and depth. Begin. So, what I want you to do is, I want you to begin by clearly stating your thesis early, ideally, in the first paragraph, so that whoever's reading it, me or Dr. Iliak, that we know exactly where you stand. For example, you might argue that nursing knowledge is distinct because it integrates Harper's pattern of knowing, especially emancipatory and aesthetic dimensions highlighted by Chin and Kramer, in ways that other fields do not. Once your position is established, you must actively construct the antithesis, present the strongest version of the opposing views. Um, Acknowledge that the legitimate points on the other side, such as the practical reality that nursing draws heavily on empirical findings from basically collaboration and from understanding. And this step shows that you understand the debate rather than simply dismissing it. So the heart of dialectic reasoning lies in what comes next, identifying strengths in the opposition, articulating its genuine weakness, and defending your position against anticipated objections. Kagan stresses that the real test of your argument is how well you reply to serious challenges rather than how many points you can list in favor of your own view. In practice, this means that you might concede that derivative elements exist. So, for instance, evidence-based protocols often originate outside of nursing. So, while still showing why the distinct focus on human responses to health and illness gives nursing an irreducible contribution. So finally, consider whether a synthesis or a middle ground emerges. Uh, Maybe, just maybe, nursing knowledge is both distinct in its integration of multiple patterns and necessarily draws on other disciplines. And the integrated insight often produces the most sophisticated writing and directly fulfills the assignment requirements to engage an opposing viewpoint substantively. So when you write your dialectic discussion post or your reflection paper, treat this structure as a roadmap rather than a rigid formula. State your position with specific references to the reading, fairly represent the counter position, raise and answer the most worrisome objections, and conclude by explaining why, on balance, your view remains the most plausible. So this approach transforms your writing from a simple declaration, I'm right, because I said so, of belief into a genuine contribution to the ongoing conversation about what counts as legitimate knowledge in nursing science. Um, so I did include in Canvas the Shelley Kagan article. He's a Yale professor in the Department of Philosophy that I just mentioned. And I guess he could be described as a remorseless utilitarian. You'll quickly figure out probably in this course that I'm not. And he clearly lays out what's expected in an assignment and he basically says every paper you write for me will be based on the same basic assignment. State a thesis and defend it. That is you must stake out a position that you take to be correct, and then you must offer arguments for that view, consider objections, and reply to those objections. Put another way, you must give reason to believe the central thesis of the paper. I highly, highly recommend that you read his paper. He provides really excellent advice, And he says that we're looking for thoughts. He says we are looking for thoughts, meditations, or reflection on H, but we're not looking for that. We're looking for a central thesis, and then you defend it. So this isn't just your thoughts or your reflections or maybe your meditation on it. You really are looking for a central thesis and your ability to defend it. And after explaining how to write a good philosophy paper, he then explains how to write a good paper. Again, I highly recommend it. Uh, so, philosophy isn't optional. Every knowledge claim in nursing science rests on philosophical assumptions. Making those assumptions explicit is the beginning of rigorous doctoral level thinking. Um, Knowledge really is plural. So Chin and Kramer's pattern of knowing reminds us that the nursing knowledge base is richer and more complex than any single method or standard of evidence that we're going to be able to capture. Um, Blackburn's epistemology teaches us that knowledge claims are always provisional and always dependent on the quality of justification behind them and always open to revision. This isn't a weakness, it's a condition of any honest inquiry. Okay, so your first critical reflection paper. Um, how do philosophical assumptions shape what counts as legitimate knowledge in nursing science? Identify one assumption, um, and uh, and then you want to analyze this and say, how does this impact nursing? So your prompt is reflect on what counts as legitimate knowledge in nursing science. How do philosophical perspectives shape what we accept as valid evidence and credible knowing in nursing? So, a strong reflection is going to identify a specific philosophical assumption clearly. It's going to connect it to at least one concrete example from nursing research or practice. It's going to critically evaluate whether that assumption is justified, and it's going to draw from Blackburn or Chin and Kramer. Um, you can see the discussion prompt again here. So a strong post is going to state a clear and defensible position. It's going to support that position with reasoning drawn from the readings, and it's going to anticipate and engage the strongest version of the opposing argument. So avoid summary. The goal is argument. It is not description. All right. What comes next? Um, 5 things for you to carry forward um, for next week. Um, Philosophy is practical. It shapes how we define research and practice nursing. Knowledge is contested. What counts as legitimate is an ongoing debate, and there are real stakes for who is right, what is legitimate, and what is not. For everything, there are multiple perspectives. Nursing knowledge can be distinct, derivative, or both. Dialectics is essential. Doctoral work demands engaging opposing views seriously. And finally, your voice matters. Forming your position is part of becoming a nurse scientist. So let me stop sharing and just say thank you for joining. Thank you for taking the class and for pursuing a doctoral degree in nursing and studying the philosophy of science in nursing. I hope you enjoy the course, and we are happy that you are taking it and that you are with us. You have my contact information. Feel free to reach out at any time.